Welcome to Joint Session, Diverse Voices in New York State Cannabis. I'm Herb Barbot, former and first Director of Operations at the New York State Office of Cannabis Management. This podcast brings together policymakers, regulators, licensees, advocates, and industry leaders to talk through the realities of building a cannabis market in New York and what those lessons might mean beyond the state. In Season 3, we continue the conversation while we celebrate the 5th anniversary of the Marijuana Regulation and Taxation Act. We look at how policy translates into practice and how practice may impact policy. Through it all, businesses must navigate change, all while trying to prepare for where the industry may be headed next. We aim to bring you thoughtful, candid discussions about what's working, what's evolving, and what still needs to be figured out. Thanks for joining us, and now here's the episode. Today, I'm pleased to welcome the President and Vice President of the Latino Cannabis Alliance. President Jessica Gonzalez is an award-winning attorney, co-founder of the Rudick Law Group. She's an activist and cannabis adjunct professor who splits her time between the U.S. and South America. Jessica played a key role in legalizing adult-use cannabis in New Jersey and has since helped shape social equity policies across the U.S. and internationally, with far too many recognitions and awards to highlight here. Jason Ortiz is the LCA's vice president. He is currently the director of strategic initiatives for the Last Prisoner Project, focusing on policy and advocacy for incarcerated individuals impacted by drug laws. Jason is a former executive director of Students for Sensible Drug Policy and co-founded the Minority Cannabis Business Association. Jason helped draft Connecticut's 2021 Cannabis Legalization and Social Equity Framework. Lastly, Jason is the founder and lead organizer of the Cannabis Unity Coalition, the nation's largest cannabis coalition that is comprised of over 30 organizations representing a bipartisan array of advocate and industry groups committed to full legalization across the United States. Welcome, Jessica and Jason. You guys sure are busy. Thank you for taking the time today.
Thank you so much. Honored to be here.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. Thanks for having us.
All right, terrific. So you both came to cannabis advocacy from distinct professional paths. Can you talk briefly about your backgrounds and then share the moment or the realization that made cannabis feel like the fight you needed to be in? Start with Jessica.
Yeah, sure. So right now, my work in cannabis spans about 8 years in legal cannabis. And the way that I got started was through advocacy. And so back when I was a baby lawyer, it was my first year being an attorney, and I was having an existential crisis about what I actually wanted to do. And so I asked myself the question, what has remained a constant in my life? I was 26 years old at the time.
And what issues were you working on then when you were still a baby lawyer?
When I was still a baby, I was actually working in labor and employment. So I was working with police unions, firefighter unions, school unions, and municipal issues. And then I actually began to work with in managing municipal liquor licenses, which is very interesting. So a lot of municipal work, which would obviously lend into the work that I do in cannabis. But that really wasn't what I really set out to do, why I went to law school. And so at that time when I decided, I can't stop being a lawyer, I went to law school. I'm the first of my family to do so. I need to find a pathway that is going to allow me to have a sustainable career in the law. And just at that moment in time, which was late 2017, Governor Murphy of New Jersey was running on his campaign of 2 Ws, weed and wages. He said, I'm going to legalize weed within my first 100 days. And I remember hearing that and thinking, well, I've been a consumer of cannabis since I was 17 years old, and it has saved me in more ways than one. So why not dedicate my life to a plant that has saved my life and that has enriched it in so many ways? And so at that time, I also thought, I'm a young attorney, but also other attorneys here are not going to have that years of experience that you would have in other more established areas of law. And so I decided to get involved in advocacy by beginning to go to events. And then my career spanned from advocacy. I got involved in the coalition, NJCAN 2020. I led the social impact committee for that. Still the most successful cannabis legalization campaign in the country by number of voters. And then from that, I helped to write legislation. I helped to write regulation. I began to advise businesses across the supply chain. And then I had the opportunity to apply for a consulting position with the New Jersey Department of State. And my company won that contract, and we built out the New Jersey Cannabis Training Academy. So my career has spanned from advocacy to law to business to policy to government and to academia, and now into the nonprofit world with the Latino Cannabis Alliance.
That's amazing. And Jason?
Yeah, thanks again. So, my name is Jason Ortiz. I currently serve as the Director of Strategic Initiatives for the Last Prisoner Project, where we help folks that are currently incarcerated for cannabis crimes achieve their freedom, get reunited with their families, and then join the wonderful movement to legalize cannabis across the country. But I was somebody that first got involved as a consumer. I was definitely someone that consumed when I was in high school. And there was a day where I was walking to school and I was smoking with a couple friends. Somebody called the school when we were walking over. We got in trouble as soon as we stepped foot on campus. There was very large security guards and tiny golf carts that surrounded us. And at the time, I really didn't think it was that big of a deal. And so, I admitted, yeah, we did that. We did smoke and I did share with my friends. And then about an hour later, the cops showed up and tried to put handcuffs on me. And that's when I really freaked out and wasn't sure why the police were involved or, why they were going to bring in, folks to take me away from school. And that's when I definitely realized that cannabis laws, like whether you know about them or not, can have really devastating impacts on your life. And I was expelled for school for a full year on your first offense. And that definitely devastated me and my family. My parents had to spend tens of thousands of dollars just to keep their 16-year-old son out of
What
prison.
grade were you in at that time?
11th. Yep. And it was actually only a couple months, not even a couple months after my 16th birthday. And I was charged with possession and possession with intent to distribute to a minor because my friend Lee was 15 at the time. And so the two 16-year-olds got double charged. And then Lee, who was actually not an adult, so he wasn't charged as an adult, got far less penalties even within the school. And in that administrative process, I looked at all the other crimes or infractions of the student code of conduct, because I then became an expert in student codes of conduct, that if I had punched someone, it would have been a 3-day suspension. If I had stolen something, 1 day. But cannabis was immediate 1 year, second offense, permanent expulsion. So I asked one of the administrators in a hearing, so you're telling me if I would have punched the security guard and ran away and not cooperated at all, you would have given me 3 days? But because I cooperated and didn't hurt anyone, you're giving me a year? And they had to say, yes, that's exactly what would have happened. And so it was during that time I was able to do some research. The internet was out, it was 2001 was the year that it happened. And I was able to learn some really important phrases that would change my life and make me an activist. The school to prison pipeline, the war on drugs, and the one that really shaped my politics, selective enforcement. And so those phrases would go on to help me understand that the reason I was getting in trouble was not because I did something morally wrong, but because there's all these political machines that are using the war on drugs for their own political and for-profit purposes. Luckily, I
And
was
you
able.
understood that at 16.
Yes. I had to, right? Because I was a victim of it. And when I would go to court, it was very clear who was being impacted, who were the folks that were prosecuting, who were the folks that are going to jail. And I had to go to court literally 30 times. And so I got to see a lot of folks that weren't able to hire a lawyer, what their repercussions were, and that was incarceration, right? And so, but my parents were two union working, blue collar workers. And so to spend tens of thousands of dollars every year on a lawyer was devastating to us financially. And luckily, though, I was able to eventually go to the University of Connecticut, where I did join Students for Sensible Drug Policy as a student. And in that time, realized that advocates that had come before me changed the Higher Education Act's federal aid elimination penalty, which was the law that said if you have an arrest, you can't get Pell Grants. But because of the advocates, they actually changed it where you could get financial aid as long as it didn't happen while you were in college, when you were already on financial aid. And so it was that moment that really showed me that, yes, I was a victim of the policies in a negative sense, but I was also the beneficiary of the advocates that came before me. And so I saw that a small change to policy can make a huge difference in populations, where that meant everyone that got arrested in high school can now access Pell Grants. So that's when I became a real policy advocate. And then again, we can tell a bit later, went on to start to draft social equity policies, specifically trying to get help for those who have been impacted like myself, and then went on to lead the Connecticut legalization effort, where in that legalization effort, we did get past anyone under the age of 18 will not get arrested or incarcerated for simple possession, essentially eliminating the thing that happened to me and changing the state forever.
So now, for both of you, how has working on the inside of policymaking shaped how you think about what real equity requires, especially today when the word itself, equity, is so politically charged? Start with Jessica.
I'll start with me. So it's interesting because one of the things that I really do recognize is that the ESQ at the end of my name has gotten me into a lot of rooms that I probably otherwise would not have been able to enter, right? So when I began my advocacy journey, I was able to have more open lines of communication with policymakers, with legislators, because they were much more willing to talk to me than even somebody who had been doing this for 10, 15 years. And so I also don't take that privilege lightly of the fact that I am an attorney and therefore somehow taken more seriously by some of these folks, right? And then when I began to really talk to them, I remember one conversation, one New Jersey senator said to me, I keep seeing you complain in the news. He was like, so would you just please tell me what it is that you want? And I was actually able to then really uplift the voices of all of these advocates that I have been working with and all of the concerns, from the Black, Latino communities and say, this is what we want. This is what's really needed, right? But there aren't at that point in time a lot of people who came from the background that I came from, who had the last name that I had and who were in those rooms. So what I recognized very quickly was that all of this is really going to come down to personal relationships with a lot of these legislators. And that instead of really me sort of going out there and bashing their names and, throwing dirt, on their names, was to attack their policies and not really them directly, because then they were much more willing to work with me. And so then being, on the inside of those conversations then helped me also when I got back out there to actually then educate advocates on, if you want certain things done, this is how I've been able to get things done. I'm not saying it's, completely 100% the right way, but it is a way. And then when I began working with the government as a state contractor, well, that was, quite eye-opening, because I come from the private world in business where things move very quickly. And working with government, things don't move quite quickly because there's a lot of hierarchy and there's a lot of red tape. There's so many agencies that really, have to get involved. But I will say that as a state contractor, where I got to work with the New Jersey CRC, I got to work with Department of State, I got to work with the governor's office, I got to work with the Economic Development Authority, I got to work with Department of Labor and Workforce in New Jersey. Being able to see all of those agencies also come together around cannabis, that's a result of advocacy. These agencies didn't just wake up one day and decide we're just going to start, working on cannabis policy. That came as a result of people advocating for it. And so what I learned from that experience was that they need a lot of direction. And so the more work that you can do for them, the more homework you can do for them, the more solutions that you can provide, the more seriously you're going to be taken and the more likely that your policy is actually going to pass. Because what we do often see is that folks come in and say, these are my list of problems. This is what I'm mad about. They come in with this incredibly angry and, reasonably so angry type of reaction of, these are my problems, you fix it. As opposed to, these are our problems and these are the solutions that we have. And then you take it a step further. Here's how I've already written it into the law. Here's how it would actually look like in regulation. Here's how it would look like in statute. And once they see that all of that work has been done, it's a lot more of an efficient process than if you just came to them with, this is my problem, you help me come up with it. So then I've tried to take all of that. And once again, whether it's educating my clients, whether it's educating community members, whether it's educating advocacy groups of, what exactly is your solution here? What are your non-negotiables? What are you willing to negotiate on? Put that into writing, but put it into their language. Because if they could just insert that into regulation or insert that into the statute, it's more likely that it's going to get done.
All right, Jason. So, given your experience, what is it that you think real equity requires today?
I think real equity requires a coordination between the advocate community, the legacy community, regulators, politicians, all coming together to build institutions of support, right? It's not sufficient to just write a check or to give somebody a license, right? Like, we're trying to undo the damage that was done of more than 100 years of racist over-policing on communities. And that is not something that we can solve easily, but it is something that we are solving. And I think one of the things that I learned about working in the policy space is that policy is uniquely situated to permanently fix problems and actually create mechanisms of change that did not exist before, right? And so for me, I'm not a lawyer, and so, although I do organize with lawyers quite a bit and have to work with them and make sure we're on the same page and they have a particular way about them, right? I'm a community organizer, and I actually got my background more in sort of the protest, anti-war movement first, but then as a political organizer for electoral campaigns. And so I worked very closely with folks before they were elected officials and helped them shape their drug policy so that they could win the election first. But then when they became elected officials, they would then introduce legislation for us, right? And that's actually exactly what happened in Connecticut, where because I had worked on 20 or so different campaigns, a lot of the progressive caucus came to me directly, like, what are we going to do on cannabis, right? But luckily, to Jessica's point, when I was the president and policy chair of the Minority Cannabis Business Association, one of the things that I wanted to solve for is being able to have that policy pre-written for folks that maybe don't have access to a ton of lawyers. And so we had policy summits to bring together Black, Brown, Latino, African American, Asian, all types of folks that were included, to actually not just say we want more licensing or we want more justice, but to write it in legal terms, covering all the different spaces. And then we use that model policy to empower anyone, anywhere, to go to their local elected officials and say, I want you to do this, right? And so they didn't have to go through that whole process, right? So once we were able to do that, though, and then collectively, I really believe the thing I learned the most in all this process is that collectively drafting public policy together is the most powerful thing that any community organization can do, because you get to reimagine what is possible. When we first started, the idea that we would have agencies dedicated to drug war reparations essentially would have been a laughing stock. People would have told me you're crazy, right? Our first policy summit was under the first Trump admin. And so to think that we would get hundreds of millions of dollars in community reinvestment funds dedicated to places that were over policed would have seemed impossible. But the last thing I will say is you have to be willing to really fight for what you believe in. All of this is only possible because we, as Black and Brown folks, went to our Black and Latino caucuses and say, do not pass legalization without equity. And they would say, well, what is equity? Give me the paperwork. And I would say, here you go. And Jessica Gonzalez is going to be here next Friday to tell you about what pieces she thinks you need to focus on. And what we did, I think, was leverage a national equity movement on local fights over and over again. Right. So we became very good at saying, well, in my experience in Connecticut, this is what I would say for New Jersey. We'd bring folks in New Jersey and say, this is how we're doing licensing in New Jersey. So we always had tons of backup, tons of very much vetted public policy to move forward on, and worked, not in an adversarial way with the politicians. Like, we both want this bill to pass eventually, right? Like, this is something that we want to happen collectively. We can both win here. So let's figure out how we all get what we need to get. All of our constituents are considered and taken into account, and write it out. And I think if you're able to do that, where you're coming to the table with some resources, but also an open mind, you can literally achieve anything.
Right. No, and I think that's great advice for people who are new to advocacy or are interested in advocacy. It's not enough to be on the correct side of the issue. And as you said, you have to make it easy for the legislator. You have to know the schedule, right? You can't come in May or June
Right.
when everything is done by the end of April.
Yeah. And you can't come in January either. You got to come in September, right? So that when January comes around, you already are ready to go and you have your stuff at the front of the list. I think the thing that I would say is still the biggest struggle is the definition, right? That like the definition of equity. Right, every state defined it differently. Who is going to access it? What programs are part of this? What pieces fall under it? Is it just licensing? Is it criminal justice reform? And at the end of the day, it is okay that each community defined it differently per what they value, right? But it does make it confusing, right? And it can make it where, in my opinion, sometimes it doesn't actually achieve the purpose. Like, it's still like a good program, but it's not narrowly tailored enough to really, what I believe, serve the folks that are most impacted by the war on drugs. Now, that being said, states are the sort of, laboratories of democracy. And so luckily we do have a lot of examples now where we can adjust, right? We can change things. We can learn from each other. We can add and remove programs. And so I do think this has been one of the biggest experiments in public policy, especially when it comes to undoing the damage done by a government program in American history.
Right. And it's gotten better with every new state, I think. Now, the LCA launched in March of 2026. Was there a particular issue or breaking point that finally made you both say that this organization has to exist now?
Yeah, I'll start it up. So, what's funny is that this really began with friendship, right? It was a group of us in the industry who we were always in the same calls, we were in the same rooms, we were carrying the same frustrations, the same visions, and the same sense that there's something was missing. And I would be texting Jason and Jasmine, I'm the only Latina in this room. Jason would be texting me, hey, I'm uplifting a Latino issue right now and I'm getting some backlash in these rooms. I would be texting Maritza, our other board member, people are confusing you and I. They're calling me you in this room because that's how little Latinas there were in this room. And at every event that I would go to, and I have pictures from all the way from 2018, 2019, where I would be in every, conference, a public policy space, an international conference, and I would gather Latinos in a room in a picture. And I can't wait to put these archives out at, in public. And it's because that's how few of us there were. And one of the times we were on a catch up call where we were really there to catch up and check in with each other. And eventually we just ended up venting about, this industry keeps excluding us from the conversations. We keep being excluded in leadership positions. Nobody's talking about Latino issues. Nobody's talking about immigration issues. And we decided that if we want it talked about, we're going to have to be the ones that do it. So,
And what would you say are Latino issues? Like, how are Latino issues different from just general sort of equity issues, other Black and brown issues in cannabis?
that they're intertwined, but the main one that really, set it off for us was the immigration and deportation issue, and how there was very little conversation that was being had about the cannabis prohibition to deportation pipeline, right? And so we decided nobody's talking about this, and really what happened with Glass House Farms, back in 2025. And when that raid happened, and when one man died.
I'm sorry, just describe what you're talking about
Yeah,
in
so in
California.
Glass House, right, it's one of the largest cultivation, facilities in California, and there was an ICE raid, and a man died. There was, child labor. There was a whole bunch of issues, in there. The industry was incredibly silent about it, and we were texting each other, about this. Like, this is absolutely devastating what has happened, but it's even also more devastating about the fact that nobody's talking about it. And so we decided, okay, we have all of this experience, we have all of this wisdom, we have all of this knowledge, we have all of this sazon. Why don't we put it really under one roof and begin to amplify these issues on a much larger scale? And we decided, we are going to really start with the immigration part of it. Because one of the numbers that people don't talk about often is the fact that 70% of those federally incarcerated for cannabis possession are Latinos. And it's because immigration is federal. And so cannabis possession is used as one of the top three reasons for deportations. And what we decided was, okay, we have drug policy experts, we have criminal justice experts, we have government experts, we have policy experts, industry experts, researchers. We are going to gather around and we are going to close that gap, because we searched for other groups. I believe so. Jason and Jazz and I, we were like, let's look for other groups that are talking about cannabis policy, drug policy, and immigration. And we couldn't find any. And so we decided we were going to be that group. We were going to bridge that gap. We were going to amplify the issue. And we were going to make sure that legislators, that policymakers, that community advocates, and the cannabis industry make it so loud that it would be impossible to ignore.
All right, Jason, you said that the Alliance intends to leverage Latino people power towards sustained political action to reform cannabis laws. So what does that sustained political action look like? And what are the pressure points that you're targeting?
So the first pressure point we're targeting is helping to pass the MORE Act in the next Congress, right? So right now, Republicans control Congress, although we are hopeful that the Democrats will take over. And the MORE Act is the only full descheduling bill that is currently live in Congress, but it also addresses things like immigration, also resentencing relief. So it would have a mechanism for folks to be released from prison. It would eliminate or at least significantly lessen the ability for immigration enforcement to use cannabis, both possession, but also working in the industry or having any sort of association with the legal industry as grounds for deportation. It also has a tremendous number of other types of community reinvestment and labor supports and things like that. So it is really the best legalization bill possible. And so we started this past May during the Cannabis Unity Week, where we were specifically pressuring the Congressional Hispanic Caucus to join on to the MORE Act and to make cannabis reform, specifically as it relates to immigration, part of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus policy priorities. Right, so that really is the number one thing now. Is at the federal level, we are targeting all 56 congressional Hispanic legislators to sign on and to have this conversation. Right, like for whatever reason, we have not been as loud and as prominent on this particular issue, and so there is a lot of work for us to do. And so I think part of it is because they weren't pushed in one way, and also because there's a lot of Latino communities that are against legalization. Right, especially folks that come from an older background or a more heavily faith-based background. So what we're trying to do is everywhere that there are folks that have a Latino congressperson, to reach out to them and ask them to sign the MORE Act. Now, of course, places like New York, there's quite a few. And Representative Espaillat is the chair of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus. And so we did meet with his staff. So you can go to LatinoCannabisAlliance.org right now, and you can take action to sign up there, to send your congressperson a letter and make sure that they are at least aware of this, but also we're specifically asking to co-sponsor that bill. And in addition, we do work on other pieces of legislation that may specifically look at immigration enforcement without full legalization, but that is definitely our top priority. Now, in the more local sense, right, it depends on what state people are in, right? And so, like, I'm originally from Connecticut. We have adult use there, relatively supportive of immigrant communities in Connecticut. But if you're in a place like Louisiana, Alabama, or Florida, right, you're going to have a very different experience of what your local laws look like. So we are encouraging folks to send us proposals of campaigns or issues that they're working on that we can advise on. And so we can't be everywhere at once, but we can hop on the phone and give you some advice of what you can do, other folks that might be in your area. And that way we can provide support for folks wherever they are, right? And so again, you can reach us through our website, but the main priorities definitely are the MORE Act at the federal level, and then having folks tell us what they need at the local level and see where we can help out.
Now, in New York, as you said, Congressman Espaillat is currently in a primary. What was his response to your visit?
They were pretty supportive, actually. Like, honestly, every office we went to was very supportive. Most of them would say, thank you so much for bringing this issue. We hadn't connected cannabis and immigration before. I heard that like 10 times, if not more, when we were there. We had staff that would come outside in the hallways later and be like, no, really, here's my personal cell phone number. Please talk to me about this, especially because staff tend to be a bit younger. And so they're a bit more supportive of this particular issue. But we've met with lots of prominent folks, AOC's office, Espaillat, right? Like a number of different very prominent Latino legislators. And every single one had lots of questions. And we could just tell no one had brought this to their table until we got there.
Like the light bulb go off.
Yes.
Right. And especially the way we did it. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think, like I said, like it was one of those like moments where it's like we knew why we were created, like we created this in the first place. But
Yep.
it was then also just that validation, hearing from, we hit up a dozen or so offices, and the majority of them, 99% of them said, we have never heard of this. We have never connected immigration and drug policy, which for folks like us who are involved in the drug policy space, it's really wild for us to hear that. But it is also incredibly educational for us because we know exactly where we have to start. Because if we know that our policymakers aren't aware of this issue, they're not aware of this connection, then the public probably is, and advocates are not, the industry is not, which just makes our organization that much more important to exist and continue amplifying these issues. But I was very taken back by those comments. And I know all of us came back incredibly energized and incredibly motivated of, yes, we knew we were onto something. We knew that we wanted to do a good thing. Here's our opportunity to be leaders in this space and to continue amplifying these issues. Because if it's not going to be us as Latinos and me as an immigrant of this country amplifying these issues, like who is it going to be?
And I will say that, like, to pass anything in Congress, you need 218 votes, right? And generally, it's split pretty close. There are over 50 Latino legislators. 50. So that means as a block, they can make or break any piece of legislation, right? And so I do think it's about bringing them together to have some courage on this issue, but they're going to need support from the public to have that courage in order to say, if we're going to advance this bill, this is what our community needs, right? And we can bring to them exactly what we need, and we're happy to tell them that. But I do think that's the shift that we have to have. Right now, we're sort of watching the issue as a caucus, where now we need to jump into the issue and then say, this isn't passing without us, and so here are our top demands, and then we'll support it.
Right. And I would imagine also, for non-Latino elected officials, but they still may have a sizable
Sure.
population in their districts. So that's another sort of avenue. But it's great to hear that the issue is not having the knowledge about
Yes.
these issues, not that they have the knowledge and are opposed.
Mm-hmm. Correct.
Right. And it's also a really big reason why we made education one of our 4 pillars. Because what we also recognize is that without access, without information, without any type of education that is translated, that is culturally competent, that is relevant, then our communities are going to continue to be excluded from the industry when they're not empowered with this. And so one of the things that we decided was we're going to make sure that when we come out with a statement, when we come out with education, when we come out with initiatives, that they're always going to be translated into Spanish. to make sure that they have that available to them as well. And we're also going to make sure that we try to figure out what is the education also that they need, right? And making sure that when state agencies are coming out with programs, that they make sure that they're also translated into the language of which their community is. So, for example, the New Jersey Cannabis Training Academy that I helped build in New Jersey is the only technical assistance program in the country that's fully translated into Spanish. That is 71 courses. It is hundreds of hours of education that I fought for tooth and nail to make sure that it was translated. But why? Because Spanish is the second most spoken language in New Jersey. But imagine if a Latina, if an immigrant wasn't in that room, would it have ever been translated into Spanish? Probably not, because it was expensive and because they didn't, at that point, were like, is it worth it? And I really had to fight to say, yes, it's worth it. Because if our communities don't even have access to this free state funded education, then they're not going to be able to also even get involved in the advocacy conversation. Right. And so this program wasn't just for business owners or entrepreneurs. It was also for, you want to find out about the industry, you want to learn about the problems, you want to learn about the infrastructure, and then you want to help out. Well, you can't help if you don't know the rules to the game you're trying to play. And so here are the rules, and they're translated in Spanish so that you can understand them, so that you can get involved.
Terrific. So now, Jessica, the LCA describes itself as having a national and transnational scope with an explicit commitment to cross-border collaboration with Latin America. So what does that Latin American dimension of the work look like, and why does it matter?
Love this question. Thank you so much for asking this. So our communities are transnational, right? What's happening in Latin America matters here, and we are building those bridges as equals, learning as much as we share. But I do want to make it really abundantly clear, we are not here to export a US-based model. We are really here to advise on other legalization movements that are happening, and we are already doing so. So, for example, I'm one of the lead advisors for Red Can in Ecuador. And that is a legalization campaign, and they're getting quite close. And really, what they did was they say, this is the type of legislation, we want to put forth. What do you think? And so the way that I look at it is, we are not here to go in and tell these Latin American countries how to legalize, just more so of whatever your ideas of. If you are taking ideas from the US, which is happening, they're looking at our patchwork of laws from around the state and saying, I like this from Colorado, I like this from California, I like this from New Jersey, and they're putting it all together. But what does that actually look like in real life? Because we know that there's pretty language, and then we also know what the implementation could look like. And so what we want to be is, we sort of want to be their guardrails. You're the one bowling, you're the one throwing the ball in the lane. We're sort of those guardrails on the side to tell you, hey, this is how it worked out over here. This was the good, these were the pros, these were the cons, this was the good, this was the bad. And then you decide really, how you want to do it. Or, hey, if you're going to think about social equity, for example, one of the things that I did was I did a South American activist project, and I interviewed 8 activists from 8 South American countries. Because when you're talking about what does the word equity mean, that means a whole lot of different things in all of these countries. Because one of the things that I figured out in South America was, when they're talking about equity and they're talking about the communities most harmed, do you want to know who it is in South America? It's single moms. That they're the ones who are the most incarcerated for drug possession and drug distribution. Right. So, and across all countries, that was almost a unified answer. Right. Which, for example, we don't have that type of conversation over here as much. So when we're talking to these countries and these advocates who are doing really inspiring work, our goal here is to ask them these questions, to help frame it for them if they need assistance to. But really, what we have on our website, on our page, is an international solidarity call, which means if you fill out the form, you let us know what exactly you need help in, we'll get one of our members to go and to help and to sit and to listen and to figure out how is it best that we can advise. But once again, I really want to make this abundantly clear. We're not going into these countries saying this is how you do it. We are having them come to us and say, we need help on this. But obviously, through our work, through our education that we're putting out there, we're already getting a lot of interest and a lot of people saying, thank you so much. And how amazing to see Latinos in the US doing this kind of work. I mean, the day that we launched, we got advocates from 5 different South American countries, all telling us how proud they are of us and the fact that they are seeing this happen in the United States. So
And you mentioned some of the countries that you've been talking to?
Oh yeah, sure. So one is Dominican Republic, Ecuador, obviously, Colombia. I just had a call with an Argentinian colleague over there who's a lawyer and a very big activist. I have a friend in Chile right now who she was arrested for cannabis distribution in Chile, and so she's one of the first people that we're going to call on when we start to do some work there. So we have already a lot of interest of a lot of folks because can you imagine is our work right now, everything that we do right now, we are self funded you know and we're not going to be charging them for this kind of work. This is work that they're going to come to us and we're just based on our expertise, based on our experience to be able to advise them but also provide that support for them. This hub has never existed, and so we created that to be able to provide them with this home of you have us here. We have folks that speak Spanish. We have translators who can help us as well, who are already on deck. So we've already thought about that barrier to entry as well. And we're here to just say, hey, you want to legalize? Let's start thinking about all of these elements. So one of the things, for example, I tell them is start looking at what your country considers to be an agricultural export, for example. Start looking at those models, right? For example, in Ecuador, it's cacao, it's bananas. Look at how they're treating these industries. It is very likely they're going to try to treat cannabis in a very similar fashion. So what can we do right now to prevent that? To prevent this sort of exportation model that can just lead to a lot of exploitation of labor, for example, right? Which they may not think of. So these are the types of roles that we want to play is let's raise some issues, let's talk about our successes, but at the same time, we're here to support you to make sure you don't feel alone and that you can learn from folks who have already done this across multiple states and have seen all of the good things and the successes and the failures across and put it in a nice little package to them.
That's great. Now, Jason, how do you assess whether restorative justice provisions, we're talking about expungements, social equity licensing, reinvestment, and impact the communities, how do you sort of assess whether they're actually delivering for Latinos?
Years off of sentences that get reduced, the number of records passed, and the amount of dollars reinvested in the community, right? Like it's very quantitative as far as whether it's successful or not. And unfortunately, some of my efforts in my home state of Connecticut were not as successful on some of these. We actually did pretty good as far as ending the sentences and commuting and finishing folks that were getting prosecuted. The community investment piece, not as much, but those are what I was most prioritizing. So when I was first coming into the legalization fight, I was actually not interested in joining the industry. I was coming at it very much as somebody that was impacted by criminal justice reform and saw the amount of funding that could go to these communities to have a real impact. And so one of the things we fought for was to have over 60% of cannabis tax revenue get reinvested into the community investment fund. Now, where we slipped up was we didn't have the programs immediately ready to access the funding. So a lot of the programs were too small, right? Folks were asking for a few thousand for an event or just kind of like help a program over here. We weren't creating after school programs. We weren't building things, right? We weren't going in rehabbing large buildings to be used for community centers. Like that's really what we should have been doing. I went out to work on the federal level, right? And try to actually move it in that. So I would measure my personal success by the amount of dollars that get reinvested into communities to heal the damage done by the war on drugs. That is, to me, the real impact. And the folks that were most impacted were the people incarcerated and arrested and the communities that got harassed, right? And so a lot of those are low-income communities, which may be very heavily Latino or African-American or poor white folks, right? Poor white folks were also heavily policed and incarcerated, right? And so it's very much a class war. But we are seeing New York, Connecticut, New Jersey, like tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars set aside to reinvest in these communities. And that is historic. And we should be very proud that we did that work and actually raise our expectations of what we can do with it. I think that is the biggest gap right now is we need folks that are visionaries that can come forward with big programs that can make a big difference in communities and say, I need $10 million for this. I need $20 million to rehab this entire building and turn it into an after school center. Right? That is where I think we could use some training. It's not as much on like the industry side. It's really organizations like the United Way or, other large entities, the YMCAs of the spaces, right? The people that have done and bought housing projects for Latino communities, right? These are the folks we should be working with and bring in all of those big players from outside the cannabis industry to say, how did you build that housing community that now serves low-income Latinos, right? Like how much did it cost? What kind of investment did you need? What was your RFP process like, right? Like all of those really detailed things. And that's when we're going to take the equity movement to the next phase. We were able to end the criminalization to a certain extent, right? It's obviously not 100% gone. We were able to advance the industry side of it, also flawed, right? But it still is happening. We have equity license holders. I think now the next phase of equity that I would like to see Latinos and all folks in equity is on the community investment side. Let's get some real visionary ideas of building things. I would like to see a museum of collective action built in Connecticut. That's one of my dream projects for a long time, to use cannabis tax dollars to create a museum that houses information about social movements that is funded by the wins of a social movement, right? I think young folks that don't have a lot of access or exposure to those stories would love to see a museum that was created in their honor, right? That actually was funded with cannabis tax dollars. But that is a 10, if not $100 million project, right? But I do see that as a way to radically change a community, right? Now you have a community space that folks can organize in. You have a place that is telling the history specifically of our movement. It is a place where you can have for-profit efforts within a museum, right? You can have products and different things there. And you have a venue that brings people together. So I do think that now that we've gotten the machinery in place and the funding has line items and budgets, now our real effort of whether or not we're going to be successful is how big can we dream with how to spend that money.
So now, who do you sort of see the LCA being for? When you picture your membership, the community, are you primarily speaking to industry professionals, entrepreneurs, advocates, organizers, consumers, or is it all of the above?
Yes. Right. Yeah.
It is all of the above. Yeah, it is all of the above. And it's really, if you look at the makeup of our board, right, we wanted folks from all disciplines. We weren't just policy, we weren't just business, we weren't just industry. So we have, like Jason, community organizing, criminal justice. We have Maritza, who's the director of federal legislative affairs for Drug Policy Alliance, and she leads our federal operations. I come from policy, from business, from legal, from academia. We have Jasmine, who is the government consultant for the city of LA and has created tremendous programs in California, but who was also a business owner. We have JM, who's an award-winning filmmaker and also the executive director of Ryan's Law. So she passes legislation while also creating fire graphics and like fire films. And we have Ishak, who is a researcher at UC Berkeley, but who has also operated, different equity programs also in California. We have Gabby, who's done marketing and education for the Latino community, in Puerto Rico. So if you look at all of us combined, we are storytellers, filmmakers, researchers, policy folks. So we wanted to make sure that if anybody was in cannabis, whether you were trying to figure out, how do I tell my mom that I smoke cannabis? How do I tell my mom that I want to get involved in the cannabis community? How do I pass a certain policy? How do I get a job in cannabis? How do I tell my story about this? That they would actually see themselves also reflected in us as well. So all of us also represent different countries. We are also around the country. So we also made sure that we prioritize geographical diversity as well in this, to make sure that folks said, okay, well, I'm in the Caribbean, I'm in Mexico, I am in Latin America, and make sure that all of us were represented. But also, really want to point out that we made also a very intentional decision to start small. And the reason we wanted to do that is because we knew we needed to be flexible, we knew we needed to be nimble, and also we wanted to be impactful. I told our group from the beginning, we are going to execute, we are going to work, we are going to get things done, which means we will prioritize a number of projects per year and make sure that those projects get done. And so I've been a part of groups. Jason, you've been a part of groups. Herb, I'm sure you've been a part of groups where you have a whole bunch of cooks in the kitchen at the same time, and everybody gets frustrated because nothing gets done, and then everybody gets demotivated, right? And as volunteers right now, who are all volunteering our free time to this mission, I needed to make sure that we all felt that whatever projects we were working on were something that was actually going to enact some change. So I'm incredibly proud of all of the work that we did in DC and hitting up all these lobby makers. I'm incredibly proud of our webinar that we put on about how the cannabis community can support our immigrant, community. I'm incredibly proud of a paper that, we're about to come out about, the number of Latinos in the workforce in California. So I'm so proud of all of this work that we've already done in our short 2 months. And the reason we were able to do it is because we have so many people from different backgrounds all collaborating with their own expertises. And so I would hope that anybody out there who is listening, that they feel also inspired by this. And also, as Jason was saying, we have a call for proposals. If there is a project that you're working on, if there's an idea you're working on, and it can't be too big and it can't be too small, whatever it is reach out to us, because we also do not want to be a group that we decide what we believe to be important without speaking to our community first. And Jason and I are not those types of advocates. Before I decided to go into advocacy, I interviewed a lot of advocates from a lot of different states that had already legalized to understand what went wrong and what went right. Jason did the exact same thing, and that's why we're talking about all this collaboration between us. It's exactly what we are doing now. We're talking to our community, and they're finding us. And I really want to really amplify that. One of the things that I'm so proud of is the amount of Latinos who are finding us that I didn't even know existed. And, they're coming from all different states and they're saying, hey, I want to participate. Hey, I do this. Hey, I do that. And I'm like, wait, we are all working on such cool projects and I've never heard of you. And I hate that I've never heard of you, but I love now that I've heard of you. So how can we get together now and help support and amplify? So that was another big reason for this is I want us to find each other. And I want us to be able to find each other so that we can work together and support one another. And that is already happening in our 2.5 months of being in existence. So I can't imagine what this is going to be like as we continue on with this work and just continuously building this type of community where I can say, I need somebody in Nevada. Who's that person? And reach out, or I need somebody in Mexico, I need somebody in Ecuador, I need somebody in Argentina. This is the kind of transnational cross collaboration that I am dreaming up, that the team is dreaming up, and that we're working towards.
All right, Jason, this is like a boilerplate question. 5 years from now, what does success look like for the Latino Cannabis Alliance? What would have to be true then for you to say that the work is actually working?
I would like to see community investment funds directed specifically to Latino communities to build educational facilities and or community facilities that are used for community organizing. Like, it is very clear to me that we don't have third spaces anymore, generally speaking, but definitely for Latinos specifically, right? Like, churches and other types of like social settings and like music and dance halls don't exist in the same way they did before, and we're getting more and more isolated. And that is one of the main reasons why LCA came forward and was received so well, was because folks were very much thirsty for community in this space, right? Even within the Latinos in cannabis, and they hadn't seen enough of us working together. Right? They saw us individually. So like, yes, people in New Jersey knew who Jess was. People in Connecticut knew who I was, right? But people in Oklahoma that didn't know about our work, right, thought there was nobody. And so by bringing all of us together and sharing it with all of our networks and essentially creating the Latino Cannabis Avengers, where it was like, oh, wow, like any problem that comes up, you have a superhero that has already not just has experience doing it, but like crushed it very well in their home state and is known specifically for that thing, and that they can lend an ear. And so for me, we would have created a pipeline of funding that goes into communities to actually build physical structures, like places people can go. The other thing is that we will have passed the MORE Act, right? We will have passed a full descheduling bill and finally, once and for all, ended the war on cannabis users. And then I think lastly, it's about having an event, and this is a little bit more feasible, I would say, where we do bring all of the Latinos in cannabis together for an asamblea, an assembly, right? Which is what we were first working on when me and Jess first met, actually, so that we can all meet each other in person and see the scale of our power. Because like, yes, it is helpful to see 7 very educated and powerful people come together to do amazing work. It's another thing to see 1 million of us, right, working together and what that looks like. And then I would say lastly, in the broader scheme of things, that our communities are organized and trained to pressure their elected officials to make this an issue and have clear demands for their local communities, right? Like I said, there are 50 plus different Congress people that can all direct money back into those home communities. And so I would want that to be happening, but it's the fact that we are organized and coordinated and supportive of each other and not fighting with each other, that if we are able to create a network of people that do lean on each other and support it, so that no matter what problem comes up, we are able to move on it, and we have institutions in place that can actually train the next generation of how to do things and places for people to meet and enjoy the work that we've done, then that will be a success. And I think it's very feasible. A lot of the hardest work of that has already been done. We already fought for a lot of these fundings, right? We already fought to move a lot of these pieces of legislation. It already exists. We're really in the second wave or in the final wave where we just have to finish the job. And so I do think within the next 5 years, it's very feasible for all of those things to happen. And I invite everyone that wants to see that vision come together to work with me, to contact myself, to contact Jess, to contact the Latino Cannabis Alliance, and we can figure out how to make it a reality in your state, in your hometown, and eventually for the whole country, and then eventually for the entire Americas and the rest of the world.
And
All
if
right.
I could just
Is there anything you'd like to add that we didn't get the chance to discuss today?
Well, I was going to actually add one thing to what Jason said. Of one of the other elements that I would view as a tremendous, success for us is I also want this to go beyond cannabis. And what I mean by that is cannabis in the Latino community. It's in movies, it's in culture, it's in food, it is in entertainment, it's in comedy, ingrained in so many aspects of our culture, and yet the stigma really does continue to exist. And so one of our plans that we talked about early on is we also want to make sure that we can be the vehicle to bring the cannabis conversation to more traditional areas like food, like entertainment, like comedy, like etc. And I'll sort of give you an example. I was invited to a movie premiere, and in this movie premiere, it was about a Mexican man who was working in these fields who wanted to be a musician, and he decided to sell weed in order to finance his music career. And in every scene of that movie, somebody's growing weed, selling weed, smoking weed, or going to jail for weed. Right. And I just thought, like, well, imagine if, we hadn't existed, just yet, but imagine if I would have been able to, bring in the Latino Cannabis Alliance to attend, something like this and have a conversation, about it so that it's not depicted in just one way, but that a more nuanced conversation can happen at some of these events where I think it would be necessary and where we could also connect with movie producers and influencers and musicians, which is who I was surrounded by. And so that is a really big goal of ours as well, is we're going to be that Trojan horse to enter these more traditional areas to continuously eliminate that stigma so Latinos feel comfortable getting involved, comfortable speaking about it, comfortable consuming it if they want to, comfortable becoming a business owner, an advocate, whatever it is that they want to be. But if they don't see us in those traditional spaces, that stigma will continue to exist and Latinos will continuously feel fearful of getting involved. And that's what I want to help eradicate and say, no, this is a field where Latinos have succeeded and will continue to succeed. Look at everything we've been able to do. Look at everything that our members have been able to do. And once we open it up to others, have examples of all of this and have it be taken as an incredibly serious industry that it is. But that conversation begins at the dinner table. That begins with your families. And so I always tell folks, if you can change the mind of your family members, you can change the mind of anybody. And oftentimes they tell me, I can't do that. I was recently, a Latino professor invited me through the Latino Cannabis Alliance, finding me out of Denver, said, will you come talk to my class? And a Latino student told me he had to tell his parents that the class that he's taking on a cannabis history class was a dance class. Because he can't tell his family that he's taking a cannabis course at a college university. I want that to change. Because what does that mean? That means that this student is going to be afraid to get involved in policy. He's going to be afraid to get involved in advocacy. He's going to be afraid to even get involved in the conversation, which means we lose a lot of really intelligent, highly capable people. And that's what I want to continuously work to eliminate. And the way that we do that is we start getting involved in all of those areas. And that's why Herb, that's why we have all of these different members on our board, because like I said, we are not just policymakers and we are not just business people, we are artists and we are storytellers. And I will want us all to carry our stories every single place that we go, amplify them, put them on blast, put a little sazon on it, and make us so hard to ignore because we have been ignored for just way too long.
So where can people find out more about the work that you're each doing and then what's going on with the Latino Cannabis Alliance?
I'll just jump in quick and let you get that last word, Jess. So, and one thing I do want to remind folks, this is a midterm election year. So every single House member of Congress is up for re-election. Every single one, Latino or not. And so even the ones that are not Latino, also press them on Latino issues because they need your vote. And so every single person in this entire country, everyone in the state of New York, Connecticut, New Jersey, everywhere, press your officials to pass the MORE Act and to tell you and to you tell them what you want for Latino cannabis community in your space. But you can find us at latinocannabis.org. That's our website. Also, Latino Can Alliance on Instagram and most of our social medias, although there is a backup account that's Latino Cannabis Alliance, so we got to be careful with the word for social media purposes. But definitely, you can very easily find us on Instagram. You'll see a lot of our amazing work, and a super shout out to JM for her work on our social media page. She's doing incredible work there. You'll be able to find our webinar of how the cannabis community can support immigration work that I think is very important. Find a lot of our policy stuff there, but it's latinocannabis.org, and you can find me, Jason J. Ortiz, on Instagram.
Jessica,
Yes, thank you for that, Jason. And I wanted to point out, so if you are in the US, use our contact page, put in your proposal, what you need support on, what you would like help on. Give us a little bit of grace. I say about 7 business days, we can get back to you as well, but we do get back to everybody. And then if you are somebody internationally and you need some international solidarity, there is also a form labeled International Solidarity. So let us know how we can help you. And I can be found at Jess F. Gonzalez on Instagram.
All right. Well, thank you. You guys are terrific. Jessica Gonzalez, Jason Ortiz, President, Vice President, respectively, of the Latino Cannabis Alliance. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you. And si se puede. We're going to get it done.
That's it for this episode of Joint Session, Diverse Voices in New York State Cannabis. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a rating and review on your favorite podcast platform. It helps more listeners find the show. In addition, please share this episode with colleagues, advocates, and anyone interested in the state of cannabis in New York. Joint Session is produced by me, Herb Barbot, together with executive producer Robert Curtis from SimLab. You can follow Joint Session on Instagram at jointsession.pod, on Blue Sky at jointsessionpod.bsky.social, and on LinkedIn at Joint Session Podcast. If you have any comments, questions, or suggestions on topics, reach out to me at herb.jointsession@gmail.com. Until next time, this is Herb Barbot. Thank you for listening.